Okay, we got partway through the nervous system in the first part of the um, narrated PowerPoint. So here we are with the second part. We will start with the cerebrum, which is a good place to start the second part. Here are the characteristics. It is the largest portion of the brain, and sometimes when we say brain, we primarily are thinking about the cerebrum. Notice it is divided into right and left hemispheres, separated by the longitudinal fissure. All of these are shown here for you, and also divided into lobes. And you can see these in the diagram right here. Some of the characteristics of the cerebrum and its components: the cerebral cortex, which is the surface, the superficial exterior-most portion, and it is formed of gray matter, which, as you all know, and if you were in class with me face-to-face, you would be telling me that this is the unmyelinated portions. The functions of the cerebral cortex are to control thinking, communicating, remembering, understanding, and to initiate also involuntary movements. So this is a huge job. Here are some basic definitions. There are all kinds of indentations and folds. Take a look at the differences in the characteristics, both here written down for you and also on diagrams. Also notice that primarily the left hemisphere of the cerebrum controls the right side of the body, and in most people there are the centers for controlling the ability to do math, analytical, and speech. So we refer to the left brain as the more scientific, let's say, part of the brain, the more concrete, the more, quote, logical part of the brain, and the right hemisphere, which controls the left side of the body, is also primarily responsible for music, art, so more, we could say, creative and abstract ideas. The corpus callosum, take a look at where that is located. It is the connection between the two cerebral hemispheres. And you can see, of course, this is a fissured or a cut brain. So this would actually be looking at the right hemisphere and some of the components of the right hemisphere, showing you here the cerebrum and the location of the corpus callosum. Of course, this is cut, as I said. Here is a list of the lobes of the brain, where they are located. Take a look at a diagram. You can look in your book and look at one alongside while you are studying this. All of these are in your textbook as well. And some of the basic functions of each of the lobes of the cerebrum. Some of your homework, this section asks you to identify the functions of these various lobes. This is another diagram of the entire brain, so we would be looking at the left cerebral hemisphere, showing you the various lobes. And here's the cerebellum. This is inferior to or below the cerebrum. Literally, cerebellum means little brain. This tells you some of the components of the cortex of the cerebellum right here. And the functions are to control balance, muscle tone, and coordination of fine motor movement. Notice that the central nervous system is constantly receiving sensory input. We do not become consciously aware of most sensory input, and that's probably a good thing. It would be way too much information. So our brain actually kind of filters out, our neurons in a sense filter out the information that we receive or don't, depending upon whether the stimuli are strong enough or frequent enough to actually create action potentials. There is a threshold in each neuron below which an action potential will not occur, and therefore we will functionally not be aware of that sensory information. Ascending tracts, you don't need to memorize what they are, but rather what they do. When something ascends, it goes up. It is sending information towards the central nervous system. So these are afferent fibers, and they are responsible for bringing sensory information from the exterior, from our environment, into the central nervous system. And this shows you some examples. But the important part to note is there are receptors that receive information, send this information up from the peripheral nervous system into the spinal cord, which is part of the central nervous system, and then finally to the area of the brain that receives sensory information. Notice there are synapses in the thalamus, sensory neuron synapse in the thalamus. Here are some of the sensory areas. You can take a look at what this says and also where these areas are located. You are able to read this on your own. I don't need to read to you. And there are motor areas of the cerebral cortex as well. And here is where these areas are located. All right, so here are some of the sensory areas. And here are some of the motor areas. You will have an opportunity to study this in more detail and spend some time familiarizing yourself with this. Descending tracts. So when something descends, it means it is heading from the central nervous system out into the peripheral nervous system. So we would also call these efferent tracts. And of course, as you probably have already figured out, these are involved in basically motor functions, controlling different types of movements. They also can stimulate glands. Here are some examples of some of these efferent tracts. So the information would originate in the motor cortex, descend through areas of the midbrain and the medulla to the spinal cord, and then finally to some effector. In this case, it is showing you skeletal muscle tissue and the neuromuscular junction, which simply means the junction between the nerve fibers and muscles, neuromuscular. Basal nuclei are a group of functionally related nuclei. Nuclei are non-myelinated non-myelinated nervous tissue in the peripheral nervous system. Okay? And this tells you some of the, in the central nervous system, in the lower areas of the central nervous system. And this tells you where some of these are located. We have some in the cerebrum and in the midbrain. And this shows you where some of these areas are located. The coverings of the central nervous system, of the brain and spinal cord, are the meninges, consisting of the dura mater, which is the most superficial and thickest layer, the arachnoid. An arachnid is a spider, so the tissue actually looks kind of spidery and fibrous. You'll see a diagram in just a moment. The pia mater, pia literally means soft, mater means mother, so this is the softest of the meninges, and it adheres very closely to the surface of the brain into the gyri and sulci. And then the subarachnoid space is where the cerebrospinal fluid is located. And then the epidural space is in the spinal cord and the vertebral column between the dura mater and the vertebra. And it's importantly an injection site for epidural anesthesia. So if you have an epidural anesthesia, the anesthetic is being injected between the dura mater and the vertebra. And this tells you a little bit about spinal blocks and spinal taps and what they are used for and where they occur. And an inflammation of the meninges is called meningitis. It could be caused by either bacterial or viral etiologies. And of course, because the meninges cover all of the tissues of the brain and spinal cord, so all of the central nervous system, this type of infection can spread and cause a great deal of damage and even can be fatal. Diagrams of the meninges. We saw a similar diagram in part 1, showing you the dura mater, the tough mother, the arachnoid, and then the pia mater, which adheres, as I said, to all the gyri, sulci, and fissures. Ventricles are the cavities that contain the cerebrospinal fluid through which the cerebrospinal fluid circulates, and these diagrammatically show you where these are located deep within the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system consists of all the neurons outside of the brain and spinal cord, and here are some of the functions. We took a look at it in showing you that information is relayed. Afferent fibers carry information towards the central nervous system, and efferent fibers carry information from the central nervous system to effectors. I'm not going to belabor you with memorizing all of the spinal nerves, but rather some more general information to understand that afferent means bringing input from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system, and this is sensory information. Tells the central nervous system what is happening in our environment. Efferent means information traveling away from the central nervous system. This is motor information. The information is carried from the central nervous system to an effector, such as a muscle. We also have divisions of the efferent nervous system. You will be expected to know these. This is part of your homework as well. We have the autonomic division of the efferent system, and this causes responses that are automatic or involuntary. This controls smooth and cardiac muscles and glands and consists of a sympathetic and parasympathetic division. Somatic branches of the efferent nervous system control voluntary responses, in other words, control skeletal muscles. Here are the divisions that I mentioned of the autonomic nervous system. So again, two branches of the efferent system, autonomic and somatic. We are now talking about the autonomic branch, or ANS, meaning autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic branch is activated during times of stress. It is part of what we call the flight or fight response, and it prepares you for physical activity by raising your heart rate, your blood pressure, and your rate of breathing. It sends more blood to the skeletal muscles, and it inhibits the digestive tract. Sometimes when you're caught in a traffic jam or when you're emotionally upset, you may activate the sympathetic nervous system. The best thing to do when the sympathetic nervous system is activated is to get out and do some heavy-duty physical activity. This is what our sympathetic nervous system was designed to do. Sometimes if you're stuck in a traffic jam, this may not be appropriate, but it might be a good idea as soon as you can to do some physical activity. In fact, get up after this is over very quickly and do some physical activity. The parasympathetic nervous system is sometimes referred to as the housekeeper. It is activated under normal conditions. For example, after you've eaten, it's involved in digestion, urination, and dilation of the pupils, and so forth. We are coming to the end of this. And this is the conclusion of part 2. Happy studying.